tree lobster. In 1918, a supply ship ran aground on Lord Howe Island off the coast of Australia, and the black rats that escaped wiped out nearly everything that couldn't fly or fight back. Among the casualties was a massive, flightless stick insect locals called the tree lobster. By 1930, it was gone, officially declared extinct. The last confirmed sighting was 1920. For the next 70 years, it existed only in museum specimens and old photographs. Then, in 2001, a pair of Australian scientists climbed Ball's Pyramid, a jagged rock spike jutting out of the ocean about 15 miles from Lord Howe. At night, under a single shrub clinging to the rock face, they found 24 insects that shouldn't exist. DNA testing confirmed it. The Lord Howe Island stick insect had survived on less than 2,000 square feet of rock for 8 decades. The declaration of extinction was based on exhaustive surveys of Lord Howe itself, which made sense at the time because why would you check a barren volcanic remnant with almost no vegetation? They brought 4 individuals back to Melbourne Zoo. 2 survived. Those 2 became the foundation for a captive breeding program that's produced thousands. Every living tree lobster today descends from that one pair. Pygmy Tarsier. This tiny primate from the mountains of central Sulawesi was declared extinct in 1921 after decades without a single sighting. It stayed that way for 87 years. Pygmy tarsiers are about the size of a mouse, with eyes so disproportionately large they can't rotate in their sockets. They're nocturnal, live in moss forest above 6,000 feet, and make almost no noise. In 2008, scientists in Indonesia were trapping rats for an ecological survey when they accidentally caught something that didn't make sense. It was a tarsier, but smaller than any known living species, with physical traits matching museum specimens from the early 1900s. They set camera traps and caught footage of 3 more individuals. The Extinction Declaration wasn't based on evidence of death, but on absence of evidence for life, which in hindsight is a dangerous standard for an animal that weighs less than 2 ounces and lives in one of the least accessible habitats on Earth. The Pygmy tarsier didn't go anywhere. We just stopped looking in the right altitude range. The rediscovery didn't come from some targeted expedition to find a lost species. It came from a rat trap set for completely unrelated research. Takahē. New Zealand's Takahē is a flightless rail about the size of a chicken, bright blue and green, with a massive red beak built for tearing through tough alpine grasses. European settlers and introduced predators demolished its population throughout the 1800s. By 1898, scientists declared it extinct after years of failed searches across its known range. For 50 years, it existed only in Maori oral tradition and natural history collections. Then, in 1948, a physician named Geoffrey Orbell led a small search party into the Murchison Mountains of Fiordland, one of the most remote areas in New Zealand. On November 20th, they found a living population, not 1 or 2 stragglers, a breeding group. The rediscovery made international headlines and turned the Takahē into a conservation icon overnight. What's wild is that the birds weren't scattered across New Zealand's vast wilderness. The entire surviving population was confined to a single valley system you could walk across in an afternoon. Nobody thought to check the least accessible, highest altitude tussock grasslands in the country. The Takahē had retreated into terrain so brutal that even invasive predators struggled to establish there. Since 1948, the population has been slowly rebuilt through translocations, predator control, and captive breeding. La Palma Lizard. The La Palma giant lizard was native to the Canary Islands. Introduced cats and habitat loss wiped it out, and by the 1500s, it was considered extinct. It stayed that way for roughly 500 years. Then, in 2007, a herpetologist named Juan Carlos Rando was reviewing photographs taken by tourists in the northern cliffs of La Palma and noticed something in the background that didn't match any known lizard species in the region. He organized an expedition. They found a small population living in vertical cliff faces so sheer and remote that no invasive predators had managed to establish there. The lizards were around a foot long, with distinct scalation patterns matching fossil records and historical descriptions. The extinction was inferred from the complete disappearance of sightings, and the assumption that 5 centuries without evidence was conclusive. But evidence depends on where you're looking and whether you can physically get there. These cliffs aren't accessible by foot, and there's no reason a casual hiker would rappel down a vertical rock face hoping to find a lizard everyone assumed was gone. The population remains critically low, and genetic analysis suggests they went through an extreme bottleneck. Night parrot. Australia's night parrot is one of the most elusive birds on the planet, a ground-dwelling nocturnal parrot that lives in spinifex grasslands in some of the most remote parts of the continent. The last confirmed specimen was collected in 1897, and after decades of failed searches, ornithologists declared it extinct by the mid-20th century. For over 100 years, it was considered gone. Then, in 2013, naturalist John Young captured photographs and audio recordings in Western Queensland that confirmed the species was still alive. The night parrot wasn't hiding in some lush, overlooked habitat. It was surviving in arid, nearly featureless terrain where food and water are scarce and temperatures swing violently. Declaring it extinct made sense because the bird is almost impossible to find even when you know it's there. It's nocturnal, cryptically colored, silent during the day, and occupies habitat that most researchers avoid because it's brutal to work in. The rediscovery required someone willing to spend months in the field specifically targeting this one species. What's insane is that even after confirmation, finding another night parrot is still incredibly difficult. Terror skink. The terror skink is a lizard native to Île de Pin in New Caledonia, a French territory in the South Pacific. Naturalists combed the islands throughout the late 1800s and came up empty. By the 1870s, it was presumed extinct. The name comes from its aggressive behavior and a bright pink tongue it flashes when threatened. For over 130 years, it was gone. Then, in 2003, a French herpetologist found a single individual in dense forest on a tiny islet. The rediscovery was accidental. The researcher was surveying reptile populations broadly, not looking for the terror skink specifically. The skink's habitat is so rugged, isolated, and densely vegetated that thorough surveys are nearly impossible. The extinction declaration was based on decades of absence, but absence of evidence kept proving insufficient when the evidence required bushwhacking through terrain most people would never visit. The terror skink remains critically endangered, and the population size is unknown. Its survival likely depends on the continued inaccessibility of its habitat. By the way, if you're enjoying learning about these species, I post content like this regularly. I'd appreciate if you subscribed. Thanks. Rock rat. In 2005, a researcher at a market in Laos came across a rodent being sold as bushmeat that didn't match any known species. It looked strange, with a long tail, chunky body, and unusual skull structure. He bought a specimen and brought it back for analysis. DNA testing revealed something nobody expected. This was a member of Diatomidae, a family of rodents scientists believed had gone extinct 11 million years ago based on the fossil record. The Laotian rock rat had somehow persisted in remote limestone karst forests in central Laos, while the rest of its family disappeared. It was declared extinct not in the modern era, but through the absence of any recent fossils, leading scientists to assume the entire lineage had died out millions of years ago. The rediscovery fundamentally changed our understanding of mammalian evolutionary history in Southeast Asia. The rock rat's survival is probably tied to the extreme isolation of karst ecosystems, which are riddled with caves, sinkholes, and dense vegetation that create microhabitats insulated from broader environmental pressures. The longer the silence, the harder it is to believe anything survived. Fernandina tortoise. The Fernandina giant tortoise is native to Fernandina Island in the Galapagos, one of the most volcanically active places on Earth. In 1906, an expedition collected a single male specimen. Despite extensive searches over the following decades, no additional tortoises were found, and scientists declared the species extinct. For 113 years, it stayed extinct. Then, in 2019, a joint expedition found a single adult female on the island. She was old, possibly over 100 years, living in dense vegetation near the island's interior. DNA analysis confirmed she was a Fernandina tortoise. The extinction declaration was based on exhaustive surveys that turned up nothing, and the assumption that volcanic eruptions had destroyed the remaining habitat. But Fernandina is huge, rugged, and covered in fresh lava flows that make large sections nearly impossible to navigate. The tortoise wasn't avoiding detection out of some survival strategy. She was just living in a place nobody had the resources or justification to thoroughly search for over a century. What's tragic is that finding one elderly female suggests the species is functionally extinct unless more individuals are discovered. Bermuda Petrel. The Bermuda Petrel, also called the Takahē, is a seabird that nests on small rocky islands off the coast of Bermuda. Early colonists arrived in the 1600s, and hunting combined with invasive rats and pigs to devastate the nesting population. By 1621, the bird was declared extinct after the last known nesting sites were found empty and decades passed without any confirmed sightings. For 330 years, it existed only in historical records. Then, in 1951, an expedition led by ornithologist Robert Cushman Murphy rediscovered a tiny breeding population on a handful of offshore islets. The birds were nesting on islands so small, steep, and storm-battered that nobody had any reason to land there. The species had genuinely vanished from every known nesting site, but seabirds can be incredibly conservative in their breeding site selection, and these petrels had retreated to the least accessible refuges imaginable. Since the rediscovery, conservationists have worked to expand nesting habitat, control invasive species, and install artificial burrows. The population has slowly increased, but it remains critically endangered. Cuban Solenodon. The Cuban Solenodon is one of the few venomous mammals on Earth, a shrew-like creature with grooved teeth that deliver toxic saliva. Throughout the 20th century, scientists declared it extinct multiple times as years passed without confirmed sightings, and its known range collapsed under pressure from habitat loss and predation by introduced species. Each declaration was based on exhaustive field surveys that came up empty. Then, in 1974, researchers captured a live individual in a remote forested area of eastern Cuba, proving the species had survived. It was declared extinct again in later decades, only to be rediscovered once more in 2003. The Solenodon is nocturnal, secretive, and lives in habitats that are difficult to survey. Each time it reappeared, it was in pockets of forest that had been overlooked or were too remote for regular monitoring. What's happening here is a pattern of localized extinction followed by the realization that the species persists in marginal habitats outside the historical range scientists were focused on. The cycle of extinction and rediscovery is less about the animal coming back and more about us repeatedly underestimating how hard it is to confirm something is truly gone. Somali Sengi. The Somali Sengi, also called the Somali elephant shrew, is a small mammal native to the Horn of Africa. Scientists collected the last known specimens in the 1970s, and despite occasional searches over the following decades, no additional individuals were found. By the early 2000s, the scientific community had largely written it off as extinct due to the complete absence of field sightings for over 30 years. In 2020, a team of researchers in Djibouti set out specifically to find it, using local knowledge and camera traps. They succeeded. The Sengi was alive, thriving in rocky, arid terrain that had been largely ignored by the scientific community. The extinction declaration was based primarily on absence of field sightings rather than evidence of population collapse, and the region where it lived had simply been undersurveyed due to political instability and lack of research funding. The rediscovery didn't require some breakthrough in technology or methodology. It required people willing to go to Djibouti, ask locals if they'd seen an animal matching the description, and follow up with boots on the ground. And at some point, silence stops meaning extinction. It just means we stopped looking in the right places. The Coelacanth. In 1938, a fishing trawler off the coast of South Africa hauled up something that shouldn't exist. It was a coelacanth, a fish scientists had declared extinct for 65 million years. The fossil record showed coelacanths thriving alongside dinosaurs, then vanishing completely at the end of the Cretaceous period. Paleontologists had found abundant coelacanth fossils in rocks up to the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. Then, nothing. The absence was so complete that extinction was considered certain. Then, Marjorie Courtenay-Latimer, a museum curator, saw the fish in the trawler's catch and recognized it didn't match anything alive. She contacted ichthyologist J.L.B. Smith, who confirmed it. The coelacanth was alive, not in some untouched deep trench or isolated cave system. It was caught in a fishing net in relatively shallow water near a populated coast. The fossil record is incomplete. It's a sample, not a census. The coelacanth survived in deep water, where fossilization is rare and human access was historically minimal. Since 1938, additional populations have been found off the coasts of Indonesia and other regions. 65 million years is a gap that shouldn't be crossable, and yet, the coelacanth didn't come back from extinction. It was never gone. We just stopped seeing it and assumed that meant the end. If this sparked your curiosity, consider subscribing so you don't miss future animal content. Thanks for watching.